So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Architecture Foundation's Bedtime Stories. It's part of the 100 Day Studio curated by the wonderful Alisa Pivaro. My name is Petra Marko, and I'll be reading tonight for you from this book, London, the Biography, by Peter Ackroyd. And I've picked a couple of sections that I will read from. The first is the first chapter of the book, which is called The City as Body. And then I'm going to jump to chapter 72, which is the Southwark, which is about the history of Southwark, because I live in Bermondsey in Southwark, but also because the south of the river has been transformed dramatically, and it's a really interesting story to hear on a Friday night. The City as Body is something that I'm sort of using and thinking about a lot in terms of architecture. And what I like about the analogy or the metaphor is one thing is the continuity and the fact that everything is interconnected, and in architecture you can do sometimes an acupunctural change or intervention which could have potentially large impact on the whole city. The other thing which is wonderful about the analogy of city as body is that it's continuously changing. So in our body the cells are dying in their hundreds and thousands every minute, and new cells are being created, and we're never the same. So every second as the time progresses we're changing, and so is the city. So I think that the combination of these two stories might be a nice thing to think about in this day and time when we are becoming much more aware of ourselves, perhaps. So without further ado, here we go. I'd also encourage you to just listen in and sit back. I hope you're all tucked in nicely and comfortable, because Peter Ackroyd's language that he's using in this book and his language generally is one which evokes all the senses. So you can imagine the smells and the images and the sounds of this place called London. The City as Body. The image of London as a human body is striking and singular. We may trace it from the pictorial emblems of the City of God, the mystical body in which Jesus Christ represents its head, and the citizens its other members. London has also been envisaged in the form of a young man, with his arms outstretched in a gesture of liberation. The figure is taken from a Roman bronze, but it embodies the energy and exaltation of a city continually expanding in great waves of progress and of confidence. Here might be found the heart of London beating. The byways of the city resemble thin veins, and its parks are like lungs. In the mist and rain of an urban autumn, the shining stones and cobbles of the other thoroughfares look as if they are bleeding. When William Harvey, practicing as a surgeon in St. Bartholomew's Hospital, walked through the streets, he noticed that the hoses of the fire engines spouted water like blood from a cut artery. Metaphorical images of the Cockney body have circulated for many hundreds of years. Gob was first recorded in 1550, Pause in 1590, Mag in 1708, and Kisser in the mid-18th century. Harvey's 17th century hospital was beside the shambles of Smithfield, and that conjunction may suggest another image of the city. It is fleshy and voracious, grown fat upon its appetite for people and for food, for goods and for drink. It consumes and it excretes, maintained within a continual state of greed and desire. For Daniel Defoe, London was a great body which circulates all, exports all, and at last pays for all. This is why it has commonly been portrayed in monstrous form, a swollen and dropsical giant which kills more than it breeds. Its head is too large, out of proportion to the other members. Its face and hands have also grown monstrous, irregular, and out of all shape. It is a spleen or a great wen, a body wracked with fever and choked by ashes. It proceeds from plague to fire. Whether we consider London as a young man, refreshed and risen from sleep, therefore, or whether we lament its condition as a deformed giant, we must regard it as a human shape with its own laws of life and growth. Here, then, is its biography. So moving on to the Southwark, chapter 72. The Southwark. That was how Southwark received its name, from the southwark of a river wall to match its northern counterpart. Its origins, however, remain mysterious. Along the Old Kent Road, at the junction with Bowes Road, were discovered the remnants of an ancient settlement which manufactured flint tools. Within the weathered sands, reported one investigator in the London Archaeologist, were many finds associated with the activities of prehistoric people. No doubt it would be fanciful to connect this long history of human settlement with the air of exhaustion, of spent life, which seems to pervade the vicinity. There is after all another explanation. The roads of the south were decorated with funeral monuments, and the memory of these important emblems may in part account for the sense of transience associated with the neighbourhood. 3 inhumation burial sites have been found close to each other, the first along the present Borough High Street. Their significance lies in their rarity, the only other burial of an equivalent date being close to the Tower of London, but also in the fact that the 2 Roman burials of a similar nature were found a few yards to the southeast. That is why travellers met in Southwark in order to continue their journeys southwards, and of course it represents the starting point of the Canterbury pilgrimage narrated by Chaucer. There have always been taverns and inns here for the welfare of those passing through. Hospitals congregated here also, perhaps in some atavistic homage to transitoriness. The Roman settlement left another legacy. A gladiator's trident was discovered in Southwark, prompting speculation that an arena may have been constructed in the vicinity where, in the late 16th century, the Swan and the Globe theatres flourished. The South Bank has always been associated with entertainment and pleasure. Therefore, in its most recent incarnations encompass the newly thriving Globe Theatre, as well as the whole area dominated by the Royal Festival Hall, the National Theatre, and the Tate Modern. St. Mary Overy, later St. Saviour, later Southwark Cathedral, became a favoured place of sanctuary for those fleeing from the city's justice. So Southwark acquired an ill-favoured reputation. There were 7 prisons in the area by the 17th century. Its most famous, the Clink, gave its name literally to other such institutions, and yet there was continual riot and disorder. The neighbourhood was owned by various religious authorities, among them the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Cluniac order, which inhabited the priory at Bermondsey, and yet it was known for its licentiousness. The prostitutes of the Bankside, practising their trade within the liberty of the Bishop of Winchester, were known as Winchester geese. So there existed a strange oscillation between freedom and restraint, which is perhaps not so strange after all, in the general pattern of contraries which covers the whole of London. The city, in a sense, feared the contagion of these pleasurable haunts. A civic edict of the 16th century ordered the wherrymen, who were customarily employed to rouse citizens across the river to the brothels, to moor their boats at night by the northern stairs in order to ensure that thieves and other misdoers shall not be carried to the southern bank. Another form of civic displeasure is exemplified in the fact that although Bridge Without had become the 26th ward of the city, its inhabitants were not allowed to elect their own aldermen, who were in effect imposed upon them. Southwark had become a kind of satrapy, thus ensuring that almost to the end of the 20th century it remained a relatively undeveloped and ill-regarded place. Yet it was not necessarily poorly administered. The rich or middling class, as always, superintended the poor and ensured that travelling paupers were discouraged. The parish vestry collected the rates and distributed poor relief, while the local courts supervised all aspects of trade. These suggestions of a relatively self-sufficient community have been amplified in a recent historical survey, which concludes that the population of this particular suburb, and by extension of others like it, was relatively stable. The inhabitants of Southwark maintained residence in the same houses and intermarried in the same neighbourhood, as was characteristic of the city in general. These conclusions tend to support the notion that throughout the whole of London and its outlying districts, there was a vital and recognisable communal spirit. This spirit has survived over so many centuries that the present neighbourhood of Rotherhithe, for example, is still distinct from those of Deptford and Bermondsey. There is an indigenous or native spirit which animates a particular area. In contemporary South London, there are a number of different areas, among them Lambeth and Brixton, Camberwell and Peckham, which have developed beside one another and by some form of symbiosis make up a recognisable atmosphere. Yet the South remained relatively unknown to other Londoners, except as a source of disquiet. The southern bank fulfilled some of the functions of the eastern pile as a boundary zone to which London could consign its dirt and its rubbish. Hence, in the early 18th century, it became the repository for some of the distinct industries which had been banished from the city proper. The tanneries were recognised to Bermondsey, for example, while Lambeth became the site for noisy timber yards, vinegar makers, dye manufactories, and the makers of soap and tallow. It was reported in the local press that a society of persons did exist in Lambeth who made a trade of digging up the bodies of the dead. They made candles of the fat, extracted volatile alkali from the bones, and sold the flesh for dog's meat. This sounds sufficiently alarmist to be apocryphal, but there is no doubt that South London already had a difficult reputation. One market gardener of the area decided in 1789 to set up his business elsewhere because the smoke constantly enveloped my plants, the obscurity of the situation, the badness of the roads leading to it, with the effluvia of surrounding ditches being at times highly offensive. South London, or at least those parts of it which were in immediate relation to the rest of the city and could be seen from it, was considered as a poor and disreputable appendage. There was always a form of urban discrimination. That is why there were so many prisons in the vicinity, as well as institutions for female orphans and asylum for the poor. Bethlehem, too, was erected in Lambeth in 1815. London was cognizing all its difficult or problematic citizens to the south. The area also acquainted a reputation for dubious taverns and doubtful pleasure gardens. It was, in every sense, a dumping ground. But the prospect of dirt or dilapidation did not materially affect the growth of London in that direction. Like the beetle which lives upon dung, the offensive smells and sounds might even arouse its powers into further expenditures of energy. The erection of Westminster Bridge in 1750 and the completion of Blackfriars Bridge 19 years later marked the real development of South London. Highways led from the newly established bridges and moved towards Kennington and the Elephant and Castle. In addition, roads were laid across open fields to join these major thoroughfares. The new roads led to fresh industrial development, so that the vinegar and dye works were complemented by potteries, lime kilns, and blacking factories. By 1800, Lambeth had assumed all the characteristics of a slum. Yet the area still grew. It expanded and developed, acquiring its shape along with the other urban developments, which snaked southwards. The process acquired resistless momentum in the first decade of the 19th century, when 3 toll bridges were completed. Southwark Bridge, Waterloo Bridge, and Vauxhall Bridge opened the way for the extensive building programs which created South London in its present form. The increase in London's population and the exertion of the new industrial forces drew the city over the Thames at an ever-increasing rate. The streets around St. George's Circus were soon thickly inhabited, with houses covering all the adjacent fields, but soon the shops and houses and businesses began to travel down the roads, which radiated from that neighbourhood. Newington, Kennington and Walworth were directly affected, and by the 1830s the whole area of the present South was being covered in roads and houses. The suburban development soon expanded to include Peckham and Camberwell, Brixton and Clapham, even so far as Dulwich and Herne Hill. It was not long before Sydenham and Norwood, Forest Hill and Honor Oak became part of the same urban diaspora. Those who have recorded their impressions of coming into London by the railway from the south have remarked upon the apparently endless vistas of red and brown roofs, dead walls, and little streets which flashed by. The prospect has been compared to that of a sea or a desert, both images evoking the power of some remorseless force which cannot be withstood. One of the principal sensations was also that of fear. It was the instinctive fear of uniformity, as well as fear of the approaching capital, which had engendered it. As the railway carriage travelled closer to its destination at Cannon Street, whiffs of industrial smell, of leather, of brewing circulated like the odours of sulphur from some unseen inferno. Since the colonization of the southern bank was entirely driven by the need for industrial expansion and exploitation, it is appropriate that the smell of industry itself should permeate the territory. There were glue factories and wool warehouses, while Charles Knight's Encyclopedia of London notes that chimneys shot up at intervals of a few yards, towering above a very maze of red roofs, and furnishing their contribution to the smoky atmosphere of the neighbourhood. The district, once characterized by its priory, was now celebrated for its protein quality. It may be regarded as a region of manufacturers, a region of market gardeners, a region of wholesale dealers, and a maritime region, according to the quarter where we take our stand. Just as there were various trades in Bermondsey, so there were heterogeneous odours. In one street strawberry jam is born in apple-human whiffs, hot and strong, in another rawhides and tanning, in another glue, while in some streets the nose encounters an unhappy combination of the three. The similarities between the East and the South are apparent, but there are also significant disparities. The East End offered a more intense kind of community than the South. It possessed more open markets, for example, and more music halls. In the South, also, there was less contact with the rest of London. By sheer proximity, the East End could share some of the energy and animation of the old city. It had, after all, existed against its walls for many centuries. But the great swathe of the river had always isolated the South, leaving it a somewhat desolate quality. It is reflected in those comments about South London which render it a distinct and alien place. A London reporter writing in 1911 remarked that to pass over London Bridge was to cross the natural dividing line of peoples. It is an interesting remark, suggesting an almost atavistic reverence for the natural boundary of the river, which changes the essence of the territory on either bank. If you stand on Bankside today, you will see in alignment the 1963 power station of Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, transformed into the new Tate Modern, opened in 2000, beside the 17th century house on Cardinal's Wharf, reputed to have been the lodging of Christopher Wren in the 1680s, while he superintended the construction of St. Paul's Cathedral across the river. Beside that, in turn is the Globe recreated in its 16th century form. A short distance away, in Borough High Street, the remnants of the George Inn evoke the atmosphere of Southwark during those centuries when it was a staging post and haven for travellers on their journeys towards or away from the great city. Close by, in St. Thomas Street, an old operating theatre has been discovered in the attic of the 18th century parish church. An account of this strange relic dating from 1821 notes that many of the surgical instruments were still very similar to those used in Roman times. Trepanning, a procedure used 3,000 years ago, was still one of the most common operations on this site. So when the patients were brought in blindfolded and strapped to the small wooden tables, and when the doctor raised his knife, perhaps they were participating in rites which had taken place on the same grounds since the time of the Neolithic and Roman settlement. These tokens or emblems of the past have retained their power as a consequence of the relative isolation of or insularity of South London. Even in the 1930s, according to A. A. Jackson's Semi-Detached London, it was rare for a Londoner to cross the river because it remained foreign territory with a quite unfamiliar, distinctively different transport system. Of course, much has been demolished. A row of Elizabethan houses in Stony Street, Southwark, was torn down in order to make way for the bridge into Cannon Street railway station. But much survives in a different aspect. Yet the revival of the South Bank in particular, with a new footbridge erected in 2000 in order to span the river from St. Peter's Hill to Bankside, will lead to a great change. South London has been underdeveloped in past centuries, but this neglect has allowed it effortlessly to reinvent itself. The point can be made by looking at the stretch of the Thames where much redevelopment is taking place. On the northern bank, the streets and lanes are filled to bursting with business premises, so that no further alteration in its commercial aspect or direction is possible without more distraction. The relatively undeveloped tracts of south of the Thames are in contrast available for a spirited and imaginative transformation. The northern bank of the Thames, to use a contemporary expression, has been privatized. To the south, however, there is interchange and animation, from the New Tate Modern to the Globe, and then to the Anchor Public House. The broad walkway is commonly filled with people. The ancient hospitality and freedom of the south are emerging once more. In the 21st century, it will become one of the most vigorous and varied, not to say popular, centres of London life. So the South Bank has been able triumphantly to reassert its past. The restored Bankside Power Station, with its upper story resembling a box filled with light, is aligned with Cardinal Wharf and the newly constructed Globe in a trine invocation of territorial spirit. This is surely a cause for wonder when 5 centuries are embraced in a single and simple act of recognition. It is part of London's power. Where the past exists, the future may flourish. So that was about Southwark and kind of dramatic transformation and evolution of Southwark. And we have a few more minutes left, so I'm going to jump to yet a later chapter, 78, called Unreal City. And this kind of sounds very much like today when we're finding ourselves in a situation which doesn't feel quite real or realistic in many ways. Every race or tribe or nation, every faith or form of speech have been comprehended within the city. The whole universe may be found within a grain of London's life. The Gate of Heaven in St. Bartholomew the Great was located beside the shambles of Smithfield. But if it is a sacred city, it is one which includes misery and suffering. The bowels of God have opened and rained down shit upon London. The most abject poverty or dereliction can appear beside glowing wealth and prosperity. Yet the city needs its poor. What if the poor must die or be deprived in order that the city might live? That would be the strangest contrast of all. Life and death meet and part, misfortune and good fortune shakes hands. Suffering and happiness inhabit the same house. Without contraries, Blake once wrote, is no progression. He reached this truth by steady observation of the city. It is always ancient and forever new. That disparity of disjunction itself creating a kind of ferment of novelty and inventiveness. It may be that the new protects the old, or the old guards the new, yet in the very fact of their oneness lies the secret of London's identity, shining through time. From a London vision springs a distinctive sensibility. All of these writers, and many more are numbered with them, were preoccupied with light and darkness. in a city that is built in the shadow of money and power. All of them have entrance by the scenic and spectacular, in a city that is continually filled with the energetic display of people and institutions. They understood the energy of London, they understood its variety, and they also understood its darkness. So they tended to favour spectacle and melodrama. As city artists, they are more concerned with the external life, with the movement of crowds, with the great general drama of the human spirit. They have a sense of energy and splendour, of ritual and display, which may have very little to do with ethical judgment or the exercise of moral consciousness. In part, they share the sublime indifference of London, where the multitudes come and go. However hard and theatrical it may seem, it is a true vision of the world. In the most famous phrase, London made me. The elements of innovation and of change are subtly mingled, together with the sheer exhilaration of being one among a numerous company. One could become anybody. Some of the great stories of London concern those who have taken on new identities and new personalities. To begin again, to renew oneself, is one of the great advantages of the city. It is part of its endless dramatic life. So that's all from London, the biography. I hope you enjoyed that, and perhaps you might read more yourselves. It's a pretty thick book. It's been amazing to revisit it for the studio, and I'm wishing you a nice, pleasant evening and a good weekend. Take care. Bye.